it.
Even like before you were.
All right. Now we're going to spend most of the next period talking about it. Herbert Hoover, he made a couple of mistakes right away. He did not start the Depression, but he helped it along. His first mistake was he met with a business leader and told him, hey, keep your employees working and keep producing your products. That was a huge mistake, because what this meant was it's going to make the Depression worse and longer last, but the people couldn't buy. Unemployed people cannot buy. So the people who were unemployed already, and finally a lot of factories wound up just closing down. Number one, and number two, he increased the tariff. He practiced what's called trickle down. And this is one time trickle down economics did not work. Now personally I believe in trickle down economics, but in this case I have to admit it did not work. The fact is nothing that we did worked. The Depression worsened. 1/4 of the labor force was without jobs. Well, Hoover wanted to do things the old way, but he was finally forced to loan money to the states, greatly against his will, loan federal money to the states. He was finally forced to put people who were unemployed on relief. Now, being on relief meant a family would receive enough money to pay their rent or their mortgage if they had one, pay their house payment, and buy a few groceries, and that was all. Not even enough to buy clothes with, so they had to keep wearing the same rags year in and year out. And as far as their cars, they held them together with chicken wire, any old way they could keep their cars together. But the hobo became a big feature. The hobos and tramps were men who realized they could not support their families, so they would abandon their families. So oftentimes they just go out hoping that somewhere they could find work. So they'd leave their families and roam around the country begging, hitching rides on trains, going from one place to another, in hopes that somewhere they'd strike it rich, then they could go send for their family again to come along. But everywhere they went, things were bad. Many Mexicans were deported to Mexico. The Mexicans who'd come in to get work here were deported. Some of them had actually come in legally and acquired U.S. citizenship. But we were told, we have no work for you. You're keeping our own people from working. You have to go. Crime increased. Hoover was blamed. Now, the World War I veterans had been promised bonuses. They were told, you'll get your bonus in 1945. Here was the catch to that. This is going to sound awful, but in other words, basically a man would be drafted. He'd be told, you're going to get a bonus for this service you do. And he'd go off, fight for this country, and go home. And then the Depression, he said, give us our bonus now. Well, here's why the government put it off to 1945. They knew that a lot of them would be deceased by then. Their bonus money would not go to their wives or descendants or their children. In other words, basically it's like Social Security. You can't pass it on to your offspring. So Herbert Hoover refused to give them the bonus. A bunch of them marched on Washington. Herbert Hoover called in the National Guard to send them away. This was a big mistake, because when Franklin Roosevelt heard about it, he said, I've been elected. They came to Franklin Roosevelt's White House, and Mrs. Roosevelt came out and bought him Kool-Aid. They gave him sandwiches, but Mr. Roosevelt would not give him the bonus either. Finally, an act of Congress gave him the bonus early, but that was because of Congress, not the president. The Communist Party gained a lot of membership. A lot of places set up towns called Hoovervilles. Hoovervilles were shanty towns made up of scrap parts, a bunch of scrap heaps, where that people would exist, not live. Hoover hogs were rabbits. When people would see a rabbit, scores of them would run after that rabbit trying to catch it. They called them Hoover hogs. Hoover got blamed, and again, some of it was his fault. The high tariff he shouldn't have done, telling factory owners to keep their employees employed and producing, that he shouldn't have done either. About the tariff, foreign countries increased their tariff. So it was one thing for the United States to increase its tariff. So in retaliation, foreign countries increased theirs. So that made the Depression worse on all sides. The Depression, by the way, was worldwide. It wasn't just something that hit our own country. When the United States became depressed, Germany became depressed also. And into this scenario stepped Hitler. Italy went through a depression. Into that scenario stepped Mussolini. These dictatorships took over Europe. Franco took over Spain. I'll have more to say about that in the next chapter. But Franco took over Spain. And in our country, all right, folk. Every time I read about depression, and I read about it in preparation for this lesson, I get the impression that Roosevelt really did not want it to end. He wanted to make it look like he cared. He wanted to make it look like he was interested in help solving it. But he would start his programs, his make-work programs, and then end them. Now, we'll talk more about the make-work in the next chapter, but there is such things as the WPA, all this. WPA, NIRA, most of that has been repealed since then. One thing he got up that is still around is the FDIC and Social Security. They're still around. Now, in addition to really make the problems worse, a big dust storm, to where the people living in that area, a lot of them died, choked to death on the dust. They would try to use rags to keep the dust outside their homes. Every time they opened the door, dust would come in. And of course, if you know anything about a closed up home with no air conditioning, it can get awfully stuffy inside. But the dust spread all over it started in the Great Plains. All right, what got the dust storm started? People over farming in the Great Plains, killing all the grass, such as it was, and all the plant life, leaving a layer of dust on top. Then the winds came along and blew this dust toward the east. Dust Bowl. The whole country, well, actually the country from the Great Plains east, including Georgia, Pennsylvania, even many miles from the Great Plains, was affected by this dust. And again, this was to add to all the problems that it had before. All this. Now, in 1928, I say Hoover was elected. In 1932, we elected President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had run for president vice president in 1920. We elected him president of the United States. Now, between 1920 and 1932, Roosevelt had bumped into a personal disaster. I believe the year was 1921, the year after he lost for vice president. He was stricken with polio. He never was able to really walk again. He got to where he could walk a little bit with somebody supporting him. But he was never able to walk. He refused to let anyone take his picture with him sitting in a wheelchair. When he was in his conventions where he had to appear in public, he would sit on a high chair to make it look like he was standing. He did everything he could to cover up for the fact he could not walk. He started the March of Dimes, which is still going on, the March of Dimes trying to help fight polio. And in those days, didn't have the polio vaccine, and yeah, he spent a lot of time in Warm Springs, Georgia, just over at South End. You can go to Warm Springs and see his home. Yeah. See his home and see his car. His car, he couldn't operate with his legs, so he had a car where all the controls were hand controls. He had to operate the clutch with his hands, but he had his strength from his waist up. But from the waist down, he was a cripple. Became a cripple. But nevertheless, in spite of that handicap, he became governor of New York. And from governor of New York, he decided to run for president of the United States. He did not really promise anything specific. He had no real plan, just he'd get in office and do whatever situation called for. Now, I'll have a lot more to say about the Depression next class. We'll spend most of the whole class talking because it lasted so long. I will say this and I'll close. I really believe that government intervention made the Depression last long. If the people would have thought the government is not going to help us, they might have started helping themselves. As it was, the government stepped in, beginning with Herbert Hoover and then going to Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was not willing to do enough until finally the war broke out and the United States got involved, then he had to. And in the wartime, everybody works. So the Depression ended abruptly, overnight. People woke up one morning and found all the factories were begging for workers, trying to steal each other's workers, paying good wages, and everybody. It was all over with abruptly. But in the meantime, it was a nightmare. Now, folk, something else I must say. The Depression was, in fact, real. I never went through it, but my dad did. There really was a depression. I mean, we think of it as been supposed. Now, could it happen again? That's another issue entirely.
Perhaps like
If it does, I believe it'll be much, much worse than the one in the 30s. Far, far, far worse.
That's a good question to ask when you, for your next semester, when you talk about those 8 questions. That's a good one.
Well, that